Western entities funded by groups like the Ford Foundation are trying to sabotage African development. He played along to gather evidence, revealing a scheme that could have massive implications for Nigeria. Critics argue that Hundeyin's portrayal is overly simplistic, calling for balanced discussions on climate policies and energy security. Nonetheless, the allegations highlight the dangerous tactics some are willing to employ. Hundeyin rejected the bribe, standing firm on ethical journalism. He urges the public to stay vigilant and question the motives behind the news they consume. In a world of complex geopolitics and economic interests, who can you really trust?
The journalist himself, David Hundeyin. Good morning and thank you for joining us, David.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
All right. David, first off, we saw your very lengthy X post up on X, and it was very alarming, to say the least. 800,000 naira for a story on the Dangote Refinery. I'm going to come back to that figure, but first give us your account of how you were approached by this INGO.
Okay, so someone reached out to me on Twitter, X as they call it now, with a direct message asking if I'd be open to doing an analysis piece on the Dangote Refinery. Now, that in itself is not such a rare occurrence. It's quite fairly common for actors within several media and NGO spaces to reach out to me asking if I'm open to, or if I'm available for a commission piece. It's quite a common thing. But in this instance, something about the wording of the way this message was presented sort of struck me as awe. It almost seemed as if, well, not almost, it seemed as if the person didn't want this to become public. The fact that there was some sort of communication between us, and it almost seemed like it was sort of a hush-hush thing. And if you're open to this, there was lots of that insinuation that there's something about this that is in some way secret or implied to be secret. So I accepted the offer. I said, okay, cool, send me an email. So they sent me a brief. And when I opened the brief, which I shared the document with you, it then very quickly became clear why this communication was done in such a shady manner, because unlike a regular brief for a
Western entities funded by groups like the Ford Foundation are trying to sabotage African development. He played along to gather evidence, revealing a scheme that could have massive implications for Nigeria. Critics argue that Hundeyin's portrayal is overly simplistic, calling for balanced discussions on climate policies and energy security. Nonetheless, the allegations highlight the dangerous tactics some are willing to employ. Hundeyin rejected the bribe, standing firm on ethical journalism. He urges the public to stay vigilant and question the motives behind the news they consume. In a world of complex geopolitics and economic interests, who can you really trust?
Mission piece, where essentially the only thing that is presented to the writer is maybe a suggested headline and maybe one or two paragraphs of suggested themes or whatever in the story. This was a full and comprehensive outline of what the story was meant to be, who the sources in the story are meant to be, how those sources should be cited, how certain things should be framed and worded. This was a story where I was essentially just supposed to color in the blanks, fill in the gaps, and put my name on it. And it also became very clear that this story was intended to use the language of environmental activism and concern about climate change and Nigeria's energy transition commitments and all those related things. So essentially discredit the existence of Dangote Refinery, to say that this refinery basically shouldn't exist. That something is wrong with the existence of this refinery. So I'm sure you're going to show the viewers the first line of this brief document, where something along the lines of following the fire incident at Dangote Refinery, this raises questions about blah, 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 especially in the light of Nigeria's energy transition, yada, yada, yada. So the very clear inference that was to be made in this story is that based on the commitments that Nigeria has made at the COP28 or or such other climate agreements that Nigeria is a signatory to, that Nigeria basically should not be supporting the opening of of a petroleum refinery because use of anything to do with fossil fuel doesn't fit with Nigeria's stated environmental goals, which as someone who has a very sort of keen interest and a significant amount of knowledge within the African development space, this immediately rang alarm bells because one of the sort of ongoing controversies within the African development space, for anyone who has any knowledge of it, is this deep-seated attempt to force this thing called a green transition on Africa, which is the world's poorest continent, the world's least energy secure continent, despite having some of the world's largest and relatively cheap energy reserves to explore. So basically, the idea is that any development economist or development practitioner will tell you that the amount of energy that is generated and consumed in an economy is directly proportional and positively correlated to the amount of economic activity and economic growth that takes place in that economy. To put it very simply, the more power or energy that is consumed within your economy, the bigger your economy is, and the bigger your economy is, the wealthier your people are. It's just that simple. It's a 2 + 2 = 4 kind of calculation, nothing complicated about it. So basically, if you're a poor African economy, like most countries on the continent are, your number one priority should be to ensure that your energy reserves are exploited as much as possible so you can generate and consume as much energy as possible, which is what will drive your industrialization and will lift you out of poverty and eventually, into the process of wealth creation. This is very well known, within the development space. However, of recent, over the past decade, there has been this very sly and snide and mischievous attempt to use credible concerns about the environment and to use a series of international climate agreements to essentially browbeat or bully or bulldoze Africa into not making use of its own energy reserves and instead going after this completely unclear, undefined, and thoroughly inadequate chimera called green energy. To put this in perspective, green energy is an idea that not even the developed world has been able to figure out, right? Something like 40% of the electricity that is still being consumed.
Western entities funded by groups like the Ford Foundation are trying to sabotage African development. He played along to gather evidence, revealing a scheme that could have massive implications for Nigeria. Critics argue that Hundeyin's portrayal is overly simplistic, calling for balanced discussions on climate policies and energy security. Nonetheless, the allegations highlight the dangerous tactics some are willing to employ. Hundeyin rejected the bribe, standing firm on ethical journalism. He urges the public to stay vigilant and question the motives behind the news they consume. In a world of complex geopolitics and economic interests, who can you really trust?
Across most developed economies still comes from coal, which is pretty much the dirtiest fuel there is on the planet, bar none, right? The UK burns coal, Germany burns coal, Japan burns coal, the US burns a lot of coal, right? There is no developed economy that runs off green energy inputs and renewables. It simply doesn't exist because even the technology, to all intents and purposes, is still very much under development. Right. So if the developed economies, the wealthy economies have not been able to figure out how to wean themselves off fossil fuels, why on earth would it then be Africa's responsibility, which is already the poorest continent in the world, which desperately needs an injection of energy into its economies? Why on earth would it be Africa's responsibility then to transition away from fossil fuel and into this completely unclear and undefined thing called renewable energy? So instantly, I smell the rats. That this article, the purpose of this article is to co-opt the voice of a local commentator in Nigeria to attack the existence of this oil refinery. The purpose of the brief was basically to write an article that says that Dangote Refinery is bad for the environment, right? Because Nigeria shouldn't be doing anything that has to do with fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are bad. And that based on Nigeria's own commitments, which it has gotten into in all these several climate agreements and accords and whatnot that it has signed up to, under these agreements, basically Dangote Refinery should not exist. And the danger of allowing my name to be put on such an article is not so much that, okay, because it's not as if because I wrote an article, anything is going to happen to Dangote Refinery. I'm not that important. However, what it does is that it starts to feed a narrative. And I'm sure I was not the only one that these people would have reached out to. The NGO, by the way, is called Dialogue Earth. It used to be known as the China Dialogue Trust. It's now known as Dialogue Earth. It's based in London. The CEO is an academic. He's a professor at the University of Oxford, and it's basically an NGO that focuses on climate issues, and for whatever reason, happens to only be active in the global south. So it's not an NGO that focuses on climate issues where climate issues are actually an issue, which is in the developed world, right? Because they are the ones who have all of the emissions. They are the ones who burn all the fossil fuels. They are the ones who emit all the carbon. But this NGO doesn't have any business with them. This NGO is only focused on Africa and the Philippines and China and India. It's the global south that this NGO concerns itself with. And I took a look at the entities funding this NGO. Who is the man behind the curtain? Because I think that's what a journalist is supposed to do.
Western entities funded by groups like the Ford Foundation are trying to sabotage African development. He played along to gather evidence, revealing a scheme that could have massive implications for Nigeria. Critics argue that Hundeyin's portrayal is overly simplistic, calling for balanced discussions on climate policies and energy security. Nonetheless, the allegations highlight the dangerous tactics some are willing to employ. Hundeyin rejected the bribe, standing firm on ethical journalism. He urges the public to stay vigilant and question the motives behind the news they consume. In a world of complex geopolitics and economic interests, who can you really trust?
And it turns out that, well, I mean, there are several institutions and there are several people, but the two
Stop
names
you
that
there,
jumped
David.
off
We're
the page
hoping that you
for
can
me-
hear us. We've been trying to get your attention for a very long while. Please, if you would make your responses brief and if you would listen out for our instruction, would really appreciate that. Thank you very much, David. Judith, you were going to ask.
Yeah, David, I was going to ask about the NGO. You were making comments about how, this seems like the West approach to try to smear, not just smear, but also stop somewhat industrialization of Africa as well. And when it comes to fossil fuel, them stopping fossil fuel, the claim of, climate action and the harm to environment, etc., etc. But I must ask about, Dialogue Africa, the firm that reached out to you. You're an investigative journalist. Have you been able to do a lot more digging on this company and to see that if this is just a targeted thing to Dangote Refinery or a targeted thing to the entirety of Africa or even West Africa? Because it seems like, looking from the outside looking in, and even from a layman or just someone who's a passerby, this seems like is why Dangote Refinery? They're just starting out. They haven't done anything. Why Dangote Refinery? Why not other bigger refineries across Africa or other African companies that are investing heavily in fossil fuel and refining?
So this NGO, which is known as Dialogue Earth, not Dialogue Africa, by the way, Dialogue Earth, it used to be known as the China Dialogue Trust. It started off as a climate-focused NGO, which for whatever reason was focused almost exclusively on China, because apparently China is where the majority of the world's manufacturing takes place, the world's production takes place, and it's also where the majority of the world's emissions happen to originate from. It's where a lot of trees are cut down for the sake of industrial agriculture and industrial processes and whatnot. So this NGO originally was focused on China, and as far as it's possible to tell, when you dig into the work of this NGO, which, by the way, I think I actually shared a link on my Twitter handle where people can actually take a look at some of the projects that it's been funded to do. I think in the images you were sharing, some of those projects were listed as well. Some of the Ford Foundation funding.
All right, David, we've got so
that
many questions to ask you. So I'm going to go ahead and read something that you posted only just, it was this year, on the 21st of July. This was your response to a post where Dangote had said, I am no longer interested in going into steel development. I'm not the only Nigerian. There are Nigerians that may even have more cash than I do. They should go into that area of business. Now, your response was, Aliko Dangote is a crony capitalist whose parasitic practices stunts the economy instead of growing it. That is true, you said. However, the ongoing extrajudicial destruction of the Dangote business organization by the Tinubu regime is not at all something to celebrate. Now, you spoke very harshly, quite frankly, about the Dangote industries here in the streets. So why all of a sudden this, what seems like support for them, or at least not wanting to tarnish their image because of a certain bribe, the allegations that you're bringing against this Dialogue Earth NGO? Why the 180?
So again, so it's not a 180, but again, this is something much bigger than Dangote. Now, I obviously have certain opinions. I hold certain opinions about Dangote's business practices, and those opinions have not changed. It is still very much something that uses the levers of crony capitalism to build monopolies. That is still true. However, that being said, this refinery specifically is, objectively speaking, an important piece of national infrastructure. If Dangote hadn't built a refinery, someone else would have had to, because Nigeria's basic economic problem still is that it exports raw materials cheaply and imports refined products at a more expensive price, which means that we're perennially running at a deficit and our currency is perennially sliding, right? So for such a refinery to exist and to function means that dynamic will be reversed, which is in Nigeria's economic interest, which is in my economic interest.
Okay.
So the fact that someone that I happen to have an ideological difference with is running that refinery, frankly, isn't really that important right now. There are bigger things at play.
Bigger things at play. Speaking of bigger things at play, there
Western entities funded by groups like the Ford Foundation are trying to sabotage African development. He played along to gather evidence, revealing a scheme that could have massive implications for Nigeria. Critics argue that Hundeyin's portrayal is overly simplistic, calling for balanced discussions on climate policies and energy security. Nonetheless, the allegations highlight the dangerous tactics some are willing to employ. Hundeyin rejected the bribe, standing firm on ethical journalism. He urges the public to stay vigilant and question the motives behind the news they consume. In a world of complex geopolitics and economic interests, who can you really trust?
have been criticism. You know, there's been quite mixed reactions from analysts and critics alike who have reacted to this news since you broke it yesterday or the day after. And many have, called you out saying that you claiming that you were offered 800,000 naira, which is about $500, to undermine the billions of dollars worth of Dangote Refinery seems untrue, unfetched, seems miserly for a journalist of your repute, or as you purport to be. What would you say to those criticisms?
I mean, I shared the brief documents with you, so it's there in black and white, the fee that was offered. So I really don't know what to say.
What they say is that it's small. They claim that why all this ruse? I mean, just to speak on that particularly, they're saying that, because I'm looking at a tweet here from you again. It says you posted this on Twitter, X. Dangote Refinery, in quotation mark, is a small cartel's political tool used to crowbar their way into becoming sole energy provider for 200 million people. Whether it refines a single drop of oil or not is completely unimportant to them. It might never actually work at Dangote Steel Mill Pro Max. And so that statement from you You now being reached out to write an article damaging Dangote Refinery, receiving $500. The critics have said all of these statements. I would like for you to give a more robust, response to them.
Well, again, as I said previously, two things can be true at the same time. I do have certain opinions about the business practices and the business model of the wider Dangote business organization and Dangote Refinery. And at the time that I wrote that tweet, it was still very much in question as to whether there was in fact going to be a functioning refinery. The context there is that when the previous president left office, I believe it was on May 26th last year, this refinery was commissioned, even though it was very clear that it was nowhere close to being completed. I mean, I had people who worked there, and it all seemed like there was a lot of political gamesmanship going on. So that was the context for that tweet, that there's something else at play here. However, to Dangote's credit, the truth is well, maybe it's not refining PMS yet, which is what everyone is waiting for, but it has actually refined fuel. So it's been putting out gas oil, and it's been putting out, I think, jet fuel, and to a lesser extent, diesel, for quite a few months. So it is functioning, and not just functioning, it has also started making an impact even in the European market. So the dynamics of the situation have changed. So putting that into context now, seeing that it's no longer just a piece of a promise in the middle of nowhere, but it's now
Western entities funded by groups like the Ford Foundation are trying to sabotage African development. He played along to gather evidence, revealing a scheme that could have massive implications for Nigeria. Critics argue that Hundeyin's portrayal is overly simplistic, calling for balanced discussions on climate policies and energy security. Nonetheless, the allegations highlight the dangerous tactics some are willing to employ. Hundeyin rejected the bribe, standing firm on ethical journalism. He urges the public to stay vigilant and question the motives behind the news they consume. In a world of complex geopolitics and economic interests, who can you really trust?
In your name, and also to receive them on. Of course, you said you haven't. But then, were there follow-up threats or incentives to lure you or to ensure that you align or ensure that you cooperate with the NGO?
No, it's really not that. This is not a James Bond plot. It's simply that after receiving the email and reading the brief and instantly understanding what this is about and where this is coming from and what the motivation for this is, I instantly knew that there's no way I'm going to put my name on this sort of thing. There's no way I'm going to be part of this. And I really had nothing to say. I mean, I didn't even respond saying, okay, I'm not doing this, and this is why. I didn't feel like there was any need to explain anything to anyone. I just basically went and made it public.
Right. And lastly, I asked this question earlier, but I have to ask you again because we're pressed for time and we really have to go. But with Dialogue Earth, have you seen the NGO make any move? I mean, you're an investigative journalist. Have you seen them make any move specific to other West African countries, or is it just Dangote Refinery and Nigeria?
So they're
very
not
quickly, because we're pressed for
so
time.
much active in West Africa yet, but it must be noted, however, that the country office of this NGO that sent me this email is actually in Nairobi, Kenya, which, as I'm sure you know, is like the NGO capital of Africa. So I'm guessing they're more active. They're trying to become more active in the African space now. I don't think they have a foothold in West Africa yet because they're operating from Nairobi. But I think even just for the fact that this NGO, which has only just started becoming
David
active in
Hundeyin,
Africa, has
I am
only
so
recently
sorry,
opened.
but I'm being told